They called him the Black Panther, not just because of his deadly instinct in front of goal, but because of the way he moved, fast, fierce, untouchable. In the summer of 1966, the world finally took notice when a man from Mozambique playing for Portugal did the unthinkable. He scored 9 goals in 6 games and dragged a modest team to the brink of a World Cup final. His name echoed through England, Eusébio. But when the tournament ended and history was written, his name somehow faded behind the golden shine of another Pelé. Why? Why did one of football's greatest natural talents, a Ballon d'Or winner, a European Cup champion, and a World Cup phenomenon never get the reverence he truly deserved? Was it the shadow of Pelé that dimmed his legacy? Or was it something else? Something darker? Behind the goals and the glamour was a young man born in a colonized land, caught between races, nations, and systems that celebrated his talent but never quite accepted him. He wasn't just playing football. He was fighting for identity, for dignity, for the right to be remembered. This is the untold story of Eusébio da Silva Ferreira, a man who roared like a king but was forced to watch his crown given to another. Eusébio da Silva Ferreira was born on the 25th of January, 1942 in the suburbs of Lourenço Marques, Mozambique, then a colony of Portugal. His birth certificate simply read, "Unknown Father." His early life was not spent in stadiums or academies, but on the dusty back streets of Mafalala, a slum of cracked roads and tin roofs, where barefoot boys chased makeshift balls through alleyways, dreaming of a better life. His mother was strict, deeply religious, and often struggled to keep the family afloat, but her discipline carved steel into her son. As a boy, Eusébio would run 6 kilometers each day just to find a patch of grass to train on. He had no boots, no coach, no future on paper. And yet, even then, those who saw him play whispered a single word, fenomeno. But the world he was born into was not built for boys like him. Portugal under Salazar was a dictatorship. Colonial subjects were second-class citizens. Racism, though rarely spoken of openly, was built into the foundation. For a black boy from Mozambique to become the face of Portuguese football? Unthinkable. But football, as always, made its own rules. At age 15, Eusébio began turning heads while playing for a small club called Sporting de Lourenço Marques. And soon, scouts from Europe came sniffing especially 2 bitter rivals, Sporting Lisbon and Benfica. What followed was one of the most bizarre and controversial transfer sagas in history. Benfica, fearing Sporting would steal the boy, orchestrated a near-military operation. They smuggled him out of Mozambique under a false name and kept him hidden in a Lisbon hotel for 11 days guarded by club officials until the contract was signed. Eusébio was 18. By the time he made his Benfica debut in 1961, he was electric. Within a year, he had helped the club win the European Cup, scoring in the final against Real Madrid. Suddenly, the boy from the slums of Mafalala was the king of Europe. Portugal, still deep in the Salazar regime, needed heroes. And Eusébio Black, colonial, foreign, was both an ideal symbol and an uncomfortable one. The regime used him for propaganda, a shining example of Portugal's benevolent colonialism. But behind the scenes, many still saw him as just a product of Africa, not a true Portuguese. Still, he smiled. He scored. He soared. And when the 1966 World Cup came, Eusébio unleashed himself upon the world. Portugal had never even qualified before. This was their debut, and their group featured Hungary, Bulgaria, and most terrifying of all, the defending champions, Brazil. But Pelé's team was broken by injuries and brutal tackles, and when Eusébio stepped onto the pitch, he didn't just take advantage, he devoured them. Against North Korea in the quarterfinal, Portugal was down 0-3 after 25 minutes. The dream was dying, and then Eusébio erupted. 4 goals in 32 minutes, 1 assist. Portugal won 5-3. It remains one of the greatest solo performances in World Cup history. Yet, while Eusébio's legend was peaking, the seeds of erasure were already being planted. Because no matter what he did, Pelé had already won 2 World Cups. No matter how bright Eusébio shined, the world had already chosen its king, and the next chapter would test him in ways no crown ever could. Eusébio entered the global stage in a blaze of glory, but even meteors fall. After the heroics of the 1966 World Cup, Eusébio was more than just a footballer. He was a symbol of African brilliance, of colonial contradiction, of the possibility that pure talent could break any chain. His performances earned him the Golden Boot as top scorer of the tournament, and he became the first African-born player to achieve global superstardom. But behind the thunderous applause, cracks had already begun to show. Benfica, the club he had carried to greatness, had become both his home and his prison. Offers came flooding in from across Europe: Real Madrid, Inter Milan. Even clubs in the nascent North American Soccer League made approaches. One Italian team is said to have offered the modern equivalent of 2 million euros, an astronomical sum in the 1960s. But the Portuguese government, specifically dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, intervened directly. Eusébio was too valuable a symbol to be sold abroad. He was declared a national treasure, and Benfica was forbidden from letting him go. His body belonged to the state. The man who could outrun any defender now found himself shackled by politics. Still, he stayed, and he kept scoring. His loyalty was never questioned, but it was never truly voluntary either. And slowly, the fire that once made him unstoppable began to dim. Years of heavy tackling, poor medical support, and playing through injuries began to erode his body. The elegant speedster became more hesitant. His knee, especially his right one, became a chronic problem. By the early 1970s, he was enduring near constant pain, but the club forced him to keep playing. There was no rest, no healing. One particularly cruel story emerged from the 1972-73 season. Eusébio had undergone surgery on both knees. Still limping, he was rushed back into the squad. Benfica needed him for a critical match, not for competition, but for image. He played, he limped, he scored, and then he collapsed after the final whistle. By 1975, the man who had carried an entire nation was being quietly pushed out. Younger, faster players were emerging. The club, once fiercely loyal, began to treat him like a relic. He left Benfica after 15 years, with 473 goals in 440 official matches, a staggering record. And yet, there was no grand farewell, no statue, just silence. He bounced from club to club in his twilight in the USA, Mexico, Canada, chasing lost echoes of applause in half-empty stadiums. He was still the Black Panther, but only in name. His body was broken, his spirit too. Meanwhile, Pelé, his eternal counterpart, had retired a global icon, celebrated by kings and presidents, a man whose myth only grew with each passing year. Eusébio was not forgotten, but he was never exalted the same way. And deep inside, that injustice festered. The world had room for only one black king of football. And somehow, Eusébio, the boy from Mozambique who had given everything, had been written in as the understudy. For all his triumphs, Eusébio lived a life shadowed by forces far greater than football. He was never just a striker. He was a black man held up as proof of a white empire's success, a Mozambican who was told to feel Portuguese, but never allowed to be Portuguese in the eyes that mattered. A superstar who wore a nation's flag on his chest, but never saw that flag truly embrace him. When the cameras turned off, Eusébio returned to a Portugal still shackled to its colonial mindset. Despite his fame, he faced casual racism on the streets, in the press, and even within his own club. At one banquet, a visiting foreign journalist remarked how proud Portugal must be of their African hero. A senior official quickly corrected him. Eusébio is Portuguese. Mozambique is part of Portugal. He is ours. Ours, not his own. That single sentence encapsulated the deeper truth. Eusébio was celebrated not as a man, but as a trophy. He had been conquered, like the land he came from. His goals were not his, they were the regime's. His body, his sweat, his sacrifice, all presented as validation for a crumbling empire. He knew this. And yet, he never publicly rebelled, never lashed out. But the silence spoke. In private interviews later in life, he admitted feeling torn pride in what he achieved, sorrow in what he lost. I played for Portugal, and I loved the people, but I was always African. That's where I was born. That's what made me. That internal conflict between the joy of success and the pain of identity haunted him. He drank. He limped. He smiled. He clung to Benfica like a sailor clings to driftwood long after the ship has sunk. And as he aged, his health deteriorated. Complications from the injuries he was forced to play through. Heart problems. Diabetes. By his late 62nd, he was undergoing regular dialysis and walking with assistance. The once sculpted Panther had become a fragile old man, barely recognized by a new generation. And yet, Pelé remained radiant. Interviews, television specials, brand endorsements. The Brazilian was everywhere. In statues, in FIFA ceremonies, in commercials for Coca-Cola. Eusébio watched from Lisbon, invited to events. Yes, but never the main guest. He had no World Cup, no farewell tour, no documentary. Only fading photos, grainy footage, and a legacy always introduced with, "He was great, but..." One of the most heartbreaking moments came in 2004 during UEFA's Euro tournament hosted in Portugal. Eusébio, frail but smiling, stood on the sidelines, waving to the crowd during an opening ceremony. Tears welled in his eyes. The stadium roared. And yet, one could feel it. He knew. He was being honored too late, too politely, too conveniently. The young stars, Figo, Ronaldo, Deco, all looked up to him. But the world had already chosen its pantheon, and he had been placed just outside the gates. Eusébio died on the 5th of January 2014 in Lisbon, heart failure. The country mourned. The president declared 3 days of national mourning. And yet, it felt like an apology whispered at a funeral. Only after death did the full truth emerge, the loneliness, the silences, the battles he fought quietly, the system that celebrated his goals but never defended his dignity, the racial double standards, the physical toll, the emotional one. He had been used and discarded, but he never complained. He was, until the end, a gentleman, a king without a crown. Eusébio's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. How do we decide who becomes immortal and who becomes a footnote? In terms of sheer talent, Eusébio had it all: pace, power, precision, charisma. He scored goals from impossible angles. He lifted Benfica to European glory. He dragged Portugal into the global spotlight. By all rational metrics, he should have been spoken of in the same breath as Pelé, Maradona, Cruyff, but he wasn't. Instead, he became the man we almost remember, the name you might see on an old highlights reel, the face occasionally shown on FIFA montages, always respected, rarely revered. Why? Because Eusébio, for all his brilliance, existed between worlds. He wasn't born in Rio. He wasn't European by birth. He played for a nation that used him as proof of colonial superiority, while quietly denying him full acceptance. He was African and Portuguese, and yet somehow, to many, not fully either. And more painfully, he existed in the era of Pelé, a media darling, a political instrument, a man who not only conquered football, but was given the stage to keep conquering long after retirement. Pelé had Brazil behind him. Eusébio had no nation that truly claimed him. This wasn't just about trophies. It was about image, narrative, ownership. Eusébio was an African icon in a European suit, paraded by a regime that feared his truth. That contradiction, that deep fracture, is what ultimately kept him from being the face of football, even if he was often its soul. And so we ask, was Eusébio a forgotten genius or a victim of history? Did we lose him too soon, or did football simply never give him the stage he truly deserved? In a way, his greatest strength became his quiet undoing. He never spoke out, never demanded more, never fought the system that limited him. He just played, and smiled, and faded. But maybe that was his final act of resistance dignity in a world that tried to deny him even that. Today, when we speak of football's golden era, names like Pelé, Maradona, Cruyff, and Best dominate the conversation. But somewhere in the silence, if you listen closely, there's another name, whispered by those who still remember the magic: Eusébio. He's gone from the field, but never from memory. In Mozambique, he remains a hero not because he became Portuguese, but because he proved that greatness could rise from the margins. Streets bear his name. Murals show the iconic image of him mid-stride, Black Panther eyes locked on goal. In Lisbon, a statue stands tall outside Estádio da Luz, capturing his famous pose, one hand resting on the ball, eyes cast down as if in reflection. Fans still leave flowers at its base, some light candles. Others just sit, quietly, as if listening for echoes. And in Portugal's modern generation, Figo, Ronaldo, João Felix, there is an unspoken thread that runs back to him. The first to dream. The first to show the world that Portugal could belong on the footballing map. He didn't need Instagram followers, endorsements, or documentaries to be legendary. His legacy lives in the purity of his game, that thunderous right foot, that humble smile, that ability to lift a team, a nation with nothing but a ball and a heartbeat. Eusébio never shouted for attention. He let his boots speak. And maybe that's why he was forgotten too soon. But not here. Not today. Because now, you know the story. Of the boy from Mafalala who became a king without a crown. Of the panther who carried a nation and then walked alone. Some legends roar only once, but that echo lasts forever.